Well, good. I always say that it's been a privilege to be involved in the broad world of philanthropy, nonprofit efforts to improve the human situation. And I always describe myself as just a lucky farm boy from Kent County. Grew up on Orchard View Farm, a fruit farm. Went to Orchard View School, which was a two-room country school. And that was a privilege. I think the concept of the old one-room school, when grades 1 through 8, or in Orchard View it was 1 through 4 and 5 through 8, it made it an ideal learning situation in so many respects. So it was great to have that experience. In those days, and that was the late 30s, 1930s, there were no consolidated high schools. We lived about 7 miles from Creston High School in Grand Rapids. And so my folks, and I had 2 brothers and a sister, and somehow we were exactly 4 years apart. So 16 years, my folks got a son and then a daughter and then a son and a son to Creston High School. Encouraged us to be engaged in post-classroom activities, and so just made that all happen, and that was a blessing. And my folks, I always marvel at my mom and dad. My grandfather, my dad's father, came from England in 1871 when he was 10 years old, and came with his maternal grandparents, and this is just background of how Russ came to be, I guess, what he is. But so they came to northern Ohio, where some of the Mawby families had come earlier and other friends, and so he grew up with family and friends in northern Ohio, completed one-room country school. Well, was an avid learner, then went to a little school in Valparaiso, Indiana, where he got a credential in teaching. And I suppose that was 1 year or something, but then he could teach in one-room country schools, and started doing that in Ohio, then Michigan. Got married and came up to near Grand Rapids, bought 80 acres, and then began teaching in Peach Grove School. So he had an orchard and was a school teacher. My dad was the oldest son, and so he went to Peach Grove School, graduated after the 8th grade, went to work for a neighboring fruit grower, Oscar Brayman. And Oscar was a successful civic leader and a successful farmer, very much engaged in his career profession. And just said to my dad, apparently, and just encouraged him, Wes, you're bright, you ought to get more education. So in 1913, when he was 18 years old, he got on the train in Grand Rapids, had never been on a train before, got off the train in Lansing, walked 7 miles to East Lansing, and enrolled in a 10-week fruit growing short course in the winter of 1913. Well, that changed his life, of course, because it was a whole different world that had been opened up for him. The contact with the university, with professors in fruit growing, the whole experience was dramatic. He went back and worked for Oscar until he got married, and then bought a fruit farm nearby, Orchard View Farm, that the family, my mom and dad, purchased in 1925. My mother was also an 8th grade graduate of Peach Grove School. She also was very much always interested in education and so forth. And so the family, and as I mentioned, there were 4 of us, all encouraged in school, all went through high school, then had the options of going on. I was the first to go to college, seeking a baccalaureate degree. So that was family, parents' particular encouragement that led me to have that interest. But it was also a consequence of very active involvement in the 4-H club program. My mother was a 4-H club leader, and my dad was enthusiastic about it and supported 4-H in so many ways. Both my mother and dad were engaged in all sorts of extension activities, the Extension Homemakers program for women. And so just the concept of going on to college became natural for me. Of course, my first experiences on the East Lansing campus were 4-H club work, 4-H club week, stayed in Abbott Hall, and that whole experience made you begin to think that, gosh, maybe this is something I could do. My dad also was very active in 2 state-level organizations. One, the Michigan Apple Commission, concerned with the industry, of course. And then in the late 30s, he was on the State Land Use Planning Commission, talking about land use for the future. And the 2 great initiatives that he was involved in were the Metropolitan Park System over on the east side of the state that runs from Ann Arbor all the way over to Port Huron. And the thinking about that, the Land Use Planning Commission did, and how that could come together with county participation and so forth. And the second was Yankee Springs, just south of us here, down by Hastings and Gun Lake. And so again, different experiences. Now he would go to those meetings, usually held in the Student Union building at Michigan State College campus. And sometimes he would have me go along and then just roam the campus. I suppose gave me $1 maybe so I could go to the dairy store and have an ice cream cone. But again, I began to feel at home and just the experience of being with him in those kinds of activities, talking, going down about the issues that were on the agenda, and then on the way home about what Land Use Planning Group or the Apple Commission had decided were the problems and the opportunities. So just another incredible young life experience. Our community had some fruit farms, a little bit of other kind of farming, but a lot of people, were troubled with unemployment. A lot of the parents of my schoolmates at Orchard View were working for WPA or PWA, the Public Works programs. The East Beltline was built at that time, and so you know people who were helping do that. They brought their teams and were with horses building the East Beltline, improving 3 Mile Road down past our house. So you were aware of all of those things. And then the 4 years of high school were the years of World War II. Pearl Harbor was in the fall of my freshman year, and VE Day was just at the time of graduation in 1945. So that also tempered life on the farm because farm labor was short. My older brother was in the Navy. And so, well, of course, on most farms, we who were kids had responsibilities and roles. That was one of the blessings, really, in retrospect, because you were, at an early age, you had responsibilities, you were part of the family team to get things done, make things happen. And so, in a lot of ways, it was a blessing in retrospect to have some of those experiences. To have German war prisoners picking apples coming from a prisoner camp at Sparta, go pick them up and bring them down for the day and so forth. Some of them could talk a little English, and so you'd talk about their lives back in Germany before the war. So all of those things were influences. Farming, of course, provided a lot of opportunities to deal with the lack of cash during the Depression. Because sure, we had chickens, we had 1 cow. My dad didn't like cows, and as soon as a neighbor began to bottle milk, we began to have bottled milk instead of a cow. But anyway, it was an exciting and significant period of time, a lot of lessons about the problems of others, the problems of kids who didn't have boots to wear to school in the winter, and just the families couldn't afford the new jacket. As a Boy Scout, I had learned first aid And the Red Cross held training sessions for first aid in our township. My dad was one of the civilian guards for our square mile. We would have blackout drills. I tried working for it was blackout, and we would drive around to see if we could spot lights anywhere, and we'd stop and remind persons of, well, you left the light on in the Bruder house, and so forth. So all of those things, and so I was engaged as an assistant for a Red Cross worker in teaching first aid at the Grand Rapids Township Hall. And just lots of experiences that do shape your thoughts and some of your values, for service beyond self, for example. The family was a blessing in that regard. My mother and my dad were both involved, and my siblings were involved, and it was a tremendous, in retrospect, a blessed kind of growing up experience. Always encouraged with opportunities beyond. The two youth organizations that really made a tremendous contribution, each in a different way, were 4-H club work and Boy Scouts. In 4-H, my partners in the Peach Grove Rustlers 4-H club were all basically rural kids, some of them on farms, but all rural. And then I joined the Boy Scout troop, and it was in the suburbs of Grand Rapids, so I was the only farm kid in Boy Scout Troop 43, and got acquainted with kids I'd ever known, and different experiences in Boy Scouts than in 4-H. So I reflect on those experiences. And for example, in the summer of 1944, which was the last full year of the war, wasn't it before? Yeah. The Michigan Department of Conservation had a real problem because of manpower shortage of keeping up with the roadside parks and with the fish hatcheries, keeping them clean and stocked and so forth, all of those conservation responsibilities. And so they engaged the Boy Scouts to have establish a camp for the summer at Higgins Lake. And Troop 43 was one of two troops that went up to set up the camp before then groups would come in for 2 weeks to do all of the jobs with Conservation Department. So one day you would be working on painting buildings, and the next day you would be knee-deep in the ponds at the fish hatchery and so forth. Just again, meeting kids, young people from other walks of life, different experiences, but a different sense of responsibility. And I would have to say that then, as more recently, I had opportunities to influence or contribute, hopefully, positively to youth development experiences. Always those experiences which I had, I thought were valuable and tried to incorporate them. I think, for example, in American society, we have prolonged adolescence for young people. You see, as a kid at 14, I had a driver's license on the farm. I don't know if non-farm kids could then, but 14-year-old driver's license. So I could take a truckload of peaches to L.V. Eberhard to his store on Eastern Avenue. I could deliver spray material up at Sparta. I could do a lot of things. And that would, so that quite different. And in all of society, I think there was engagement of youth in quite a different way than is characteristic now. And so adolescence is prolonged, I think, into the mid, sometimes late 20s for many young people. And we need to change that in a positive sense. I'm not talking about child labor. I'm talking about the opportunity to live life in a more realistic sense and to contribute through my own productivity and my contributions to others in positive ways. And it changes then not just the physical engagement, but the mental mindset and the values, which kind of then are reflected in all aspects of life. Typically, at the Mawby household, depending on schedules, we had breakfast together. Lunch depended on whether you were working on the farm or whether you were, and if it was on the farm, we usually had 2 or 3 hired men who also had lunch with the family. And then at supper time, we didn't have dinner except on Sunday. Supper time, we would, talk about what had gone well that day and where the problems were and what was exciting and what were plans for tomorrow. So it was in conversational exchange and so forth. And when I was, when I was 10, Ed was 18. So he was living a different life than I was living. And that was interesting to be a part of and relate to. So that it was very much family enterprise, but pretty typical of a lot of families in our community, and a lot of community activities and projects. And the school was very much a community center with various activities which engaged family and which engaged kids of all of the ages in community participation. So the other thing that I still remember is that many of the kids in Orchard View School were first generation. Their parents came from abroad, and that usually was Germany or Italy or Poland for some reason in our community, related not to farming generally, but to the employment in town, where you had all of the furniture industry, all of the woodworking industry, and the manufacturing, starting for the auto industry and so forth. And so at home, there might be some conversation in Dutch with the Buitendijks across the road from the school, or in Polish or German, but the parents always insisted everything was done in English because their kids were Americans. And that's, again, a difference that sort of has taken place in our society, I think. So many people want to be immigrants to the United States, but they don't want to become Americans. And I think that's a change that we as a society need to be concerned about. But everybody, they had some of those traditions, and they were very often, when you had a potluck, you would have a Polish specialty, or we'd just know that they're going to bring this because that's all that was exciting. Yeah, you bet. So it was a wonderful, you can talk about some of the problems, but we were never poor. We didn't talk about it. And the folks managed things carefully, but we were, we didn't have a lot of money, but we were never poor. You appreciate more in retrospect what values my parents had. We didn't sit around the table and talk about values, but you knew that, and my dad, nobody in the family ever smoked. We never had alcohol. It wasn't an issue, it just wasn't a question. It was just a part of the Mawby family. And those were always lessons learned. Went to Michigan State, majored in agriculture, and of course, more specifically in horticulture. I really thought I would be a fruit grower. I admired, my dad was an early adopter of sociologist terms. For example, many of the orchards in Sparta and around Grand Rapids had started as dairy farms. The typical family farm in Michigan had a combination of enterprise, and usually it was built around a small dairy herd, 10 to 15 cows. So you got a milk check every 2 weeks, and that was sort of a stable part. And then you might get into fruit growing, or you might raise hogs, or you might have, specialize. But it was a combination of enterprise. And so that and even if you were a dairy farmer as your major source of income, you probably had 50 hens. So you had, if you look at farm management records of that period of time, and one of the experiences I had at Michigan State, farm management had a farm record-keeping program in which farmers kept records and sent their annual reports in, and we helped summarize them and analyze them. But, you know, the farm would have 12 dairy cows, it would have 50 hens, it would have 2 sows for pork, you got some pigs to sell, but a couple to use at home. And so most of the fruit growers for apple storage changed, they got out of dairy farming, changed the basement of the barn, cleaned it out, and changed it into an apple storage. My dad was one of the first. We never had a big dairy barn. He didn't like cows. So as soon as we could get rid of the last cow for milk, when Half Woodworth started bottling milk and delivering it, we got milk on the back door. We didn't have a barn to convert. My dad was one of the first to build an apple storage. Tile, insulated, and with fans and so forth. We would bring in huge pieces of ice to put in the bunkers to cool the apples in the fall. But it was a building designed for apple storage, and then it was added on, and then it was mechanical refrigeration and so forth. But then you add a packing house because the industry changed. So he was one of the pioneers in apple storage and the farm-based packing house, so that you could sell directly to supermarket systems. Then, of course, you're not old enough to remember when you went to the grocery store, you went to Johnny Hines' store on Plainfield Avenue, and my mother, we would go in and she would, you know, stop, have a clerk, would take care of, and you'd ask for 5 pounds of sugar, and then you needed a box of salt, and then you needed a bag of flour, and 2 cans of peas, and the clerk would go collect all of those, and you'd pay for it, and he would help carry it out to your car. Well, then we began to shift to self-service, and there were 2 pioneers in this area, One was L.V. Eberhard, and that name is familiar at Grand Valley State University. L.V. was one of the first out on Eastern Avenue to have a self-service supermarket. It had a door with a light on it so that when you walked in, it opened the door, and that was a new feature. And then you had a cart and went around and picked up your own goods, and then a checkout counter. And L.V. was one of the pioneers. And another was a gentleman named Frederick Meyer, and he was at Greenville. Now, L.V. Eberhard and Frederick Meyer and their other counterparts then didn't want apples in a bushel basket. Otherwise, you know, they had a basket of apples, and you'd say, I need 3 pounds of apples, and they'd go weigh them out. So that they wanted prepackaged bags. And these were 5-pound purple mesh bags with apples in them. 6 of those bags would fit in a standard bushel crate. And so I had an early career in delivering apples to Frederick Meyer when he had 1 store at Greenville, and then a second one at Ionia, and then a third one at the corner of Fuller and just off Fuller. Where was it? Anyway. So when Fred Meyer and I see each other now, we still talk about those early days. But my dad was a pioneer in those kinds of things. So that was just another part of growing up and getting acquainted with people like Fred Meyer, who was an innovator, but also had great social and societal commitment for community and so forth. Well, anyway, back to Michigan State College. Went there with a major in horticulture, specifically pomology. Now, you know that pomology is fruit growing, olericulture is vegetable growing, and floriculture is obvious. So I was a pomology major. And that was a marvelous experience. It was right after the war, and veterans were coming back and had priority on dormitory housing quite appropriately. So I lived in a little boarding house off campus for my freshman year, became a member then of the national professional and social fraternity called Alpha Gamma Rho, and moved into the fraternity house. And that was a very positive experience and a lifelong relationship in leaders in agriculture, Michigan and across the country. So that was a very positive part of life. Majoring in horticulture and doing pretty well as a student. I'll just mention, at that point, ROTC was required for freshmen and sophomore men. So I had 2 years of military. If you opted for the 4-year option, you ended up as a second lieutenant and had, I'm not sure, 2 or 4 years of service. I was just 2 years in ROTC. That again, I'd say, was a positive experience and in a lot of ways. So again, I think society needs to rethink about some of the things which maybe are, in quotes, required as a part of concern for service to all others and service to country, national, as well as sort of self-centered choices. Toward the end of my sophomore year, and I had become engaged in the college activities, particularly the College of Agriculture and in the horticulture club. Became a member of Alpha Zeta at a very early age in my college career. Alpha Zeta is the agricultural academic honorary. Became involved in the Ag Council, the student group within and was a reporter on the state news, the school newspaper. See, a reporter. So was engaged in college broadly. But in the spring of my sophomore year, the head of the department stopped me in the hall of the horticulture building, and I was surprised that he knew me. He just stopped. He said, Mr. Mawby, he was more formal than I didn't, and Mr. Mawby, could you step into my office? I'd like to speak to you. Well, you know, I wondered what's gone wrong. But he just said, Russ, you're doing well as a student. We're proud of you. Keep that up. And we're pleased that you're a horticulture major. But I just have an idea that I would share with you for you to think about. He said, if you're really going to be a horticulturalist, as a career, you'll need to get a master's degree and probably a PhD degree. And we'll make you a specialist then. He said, I suggest you think about for your junior and senior years, you take as few courses in horticulture as we'll let you take and still be a horticultural graduate. Take as few courses in the College of Agriculture as we'll let you get by with and still have a degree in agriculture, and that you then use the freedom in your course selection that offers to sample this great university. He said, I don't have any ideas about what you study. Great religions of the world, literature, music, physics, anything, but sample this university. And I took his advice. I enjoyed writing, and so I really had enough credits to have a degree in journalism. At that time, they didn't have an agricultural communications major, but I did a lot of journalism work. I took courses in geography, took courses in history, beyond the requirements and so forth, and just became broadly, and similarly became more broadly engaged in student activities across the campus, one of which led to the creation in our senior year of a magazine for the combined colleges of agriculture and home economics. And it was called the MSU Homesteader. Agriculture and home economics, the whole profession of home economics was started in colleges of agriculture. And that's, I always think interesting, started in the early 1900s, like 1905, 1910, as colleges of agriculture develop extension services, working with farms on farm management and farm technology and so forth, they then become concerned with improving the quality of family life on the farm, and the house, and interior design, and experiences, and foods, and nutrition, and clothing, and so forth. And so home economics in most institutions started as a department in the College of Agriculture and then moved to college status. So it was natural then in working. So I became good friends of the dean of the College of Home Economics and department people there, and then students, and we created the MSU Homesteader magazine. For the first year, I was the editor. And so it was just another aspect of college life. So that was sort of college. Now, another great experience came about between my junior and senior year. And the 4-H club program nationally launched an international exchange program for 4-H young people. And it grew out of an initiative by 3 farm kids in the state of New York who had served in Europe in World War II and came back with the notion that people in Europe don't know us and we don't know them, and there ought to be communication, and there ought to be an opportunity for 4-H kids to go and live with families there, and for the kids from there to come and live with families here. So the first year of that program was 1948, called the International, first couple of years called the International Farm Youth Exchange, but then changed to International 4-H Youth Exchange, because a lot of 4-H kids aren't farm kids. They may be rural. They can even be center city now. And so there were 17 of us from 17 different states that went to Europe in the summer of 1948. And again, that was a life-changing experience. Now, I went to the United Kingdom, mostly in England and Wales. And so language wasn't a problem. Others went to Sweden and Denmark and Italy and France and so forth. But it was a great experience in all sorts of ways. And again, influenced then my kind of course selection in my senior year, following Dr. Tukey's suggestion of sample this university, got into different kind of course selection and activities. So all of those tremendous influences of sort of growing up kind of shaped a lot of my ideas, my concerns, my priorities, the values by which I try to live. Well, yeah, I've always been concerned with the importance of relationships between people individually, and relationships between people in communities to make difference, or in organizations, institutions. You have to work together to make things happen, and so I've always been engaged. I've always volunteered. Even when I was in the Army for 2 years, I volunteered, and everyone said, never volunteer. Well, you had some different experiences, and I could talk about 2 blessed years in the Army, which happened after I'd completed the master's degree and most of my PhD degree. And so I was but I was drafted. It was the military draft. See, I still would favor compulsory public service. I would broaden it from military to all of the other. I think it'd just be great for all young people to be engaged in an initiative and a contribution which can develop life skills also, but it certainly changes values and mindset about what an individual can do if she or he wishes to do with their life. So anyway, I just by pattern, again, my mom and my dad volunteered. They were, collecting for United Way in our rural community before most rural communities did anything with United Way. So I was just engaged, would volunteer, and out of that you get, I guess, identified or labeled as a leader. My description of a leader is anyone who sees either a problem that needs to be addressed or an opportunity that ought to be capitalized on, and then does something about it. And the person who's a leader in the neighborhood in providing, getting a little league ball game, a team started for kids, is quite a different person that will be concerned about how do we create better home services for the elderly. But the pattern may lead the kid who's been in Little League to be concerned about doing something for home care for the elderly. So leadership comes in all shapes and sizes and manifestations depending on the issue and the opportunity. So yeah, I saw an opportunity here to get students in agriculture and home economics working together in their courses of study, and which would frame perhaps the kinds of things they do when they become a home economics teacher, wherever that is, or simply a parent in a community concerned with whatever the issue may be. So it just has, and I still have that bad habit of not saying no as often as I ought to. My first job was with the Michigan State University in the Cooperative Extension Service. And I was an extension specialist in public policy. My horticulture degree changed to a degree, master's degree in agricultural economics. I wanted something broader. If there'd been a major in ag communications, I might have gone that way, but I went to ag economics because I then became concerned with management and marketing and those aspects. And then in my doctorate became more concerned with policy issues and the importance of policy issues nationally, all the way down locally, relate to policy decisions. Simple statement, all of the drinking water in Michigan, now this is overly simplified because you can find it, but all of the drinking water in Michigan is groundwater. It comes from underground. And underground quality is a responsibility in policy terms, not of the state of Michigan, not of the counties of Michigan, townships. And so when you want to deal with water quality and dealing with issues of pollution, for example, townships are the first players in carrying that out. So I became concerned, intrigued with all of those sort of idiosyncrasies, because here's the underground water flowing, it's lakes, it's rivers, and so it starts in your township and you pollute it and it comes to my township. There we are. And now how are we going to solve that problem? So became intrigued with all those kinds of issues. Became assistant director then. You talk about blessings of a farm kid. Became assistant director of the Cooperative Extension Service for Michigan State University on July 1st of 1956. I'd been in the Army 1953, 4, 5. Came back and picked up as an extension specialist in agricultural extension and policy issues. It was the time when farmers came under Social Security. Until then they had no retirement program. Social Security became available, and so I was involved in designing a program and educating farmers. You're 67 and you're thinking about retirement. How can you get into extension? Somebody else is 23 starting out in farming. What does he want to do about Social Security? And so that was my first opportunity after the Army. Then, to my surprise, I got a call from the dean, and I wondered what had gone awry again. Went and met with him, and he and the director of extension simply said, Russ, this was in May, we'd like to have you become assistant director of extension responsible for youth 4-H and youth programming on July 1. Well, Ruth and I talked about that and decided that'd be a wonderful opportunity, so I became assistant director of extension. And this leads me to the transition to Kellogg, because one of the problems of the extension service was getting understanding cooperative meant that you had some federal resources, you had the land-grant university, and then you had the county extension office. And the county usually provided support with secretarial staff for travel and operations and so forth. So having county involvement was important. And it was difficult for many people in local government and so forth to appreciate that cooperative relationship. And we needed to develop stronger agricultural leadership, farm leadership throughout the state. Young women and men engaged in farming who would become concerned with policy issues, become engaged in county or township and school board activities, etc. And so the Director of Extension asked two of us to think about some kind of a leadership program for the state of Michigan for people engaged in farming. And so I was one of two that had that responsibility of designing what we called a farmers study program. And we put together a wonderful plan and sent it to the Kellogg Foundation, and it didn't go anywhere. That was just coincidence. That was the summer of 1960, spring and summer of 1964. In October of 1964, I got a call from a fellow, this is more detailed, Glenwood Creech. You talk about human relations. I'd come acquainted with Glenwood Creech in an interesting way because he was involved with the National Agricultural Extension Center for Advanced Study at the University of Wisconsin. And I won't go into detail on that, but I got a call from Glenn Creech and he's saying, Russ, I've decided I'm leaving the Kellogg Foundation, going back to my alma mater, the University of Kentucky. And Dr. Morris, who was the president, would like to talk with you about the opportunity of coming here. And I said, oh, Glenn, gee whiz, here I am. I think my future's in the academic world. I'm enjoying it. I was a tenured full professor at age 35 or something. And I said, I just don't think it'd be fair to take any of Dr. Morris's time because I don't really think, oh, he said you ought to come down and talk with him. I said, all right, Glenn, if Dr. Morris understands that I really am not looking for a job. So I went down and had lunch with Dr. Morris and then worked there for 30 years. I was intrigued with the opportunity. As we talked about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and what it had been and what its prospects and opportunities were for the future. And so I accepted the position. I joined the foundation on December 1, 1964 as director of the Division of Agriculture. And there were 7 program divisions, and agriculture was the one for which I had responsibility. And one of the early prospects that got reactivated was Michigan State University had a request for a farmer study program. And by golly, it got funded. And then it was replicated at 4 other states with foundation assistance, different models. And then it sort of swept the country, and there are still 37 states that have active farmer study programs based on that early model. Anyway, that's just coincidence. So I had the privilege of becoming a part of it. There were 7 program teams. Mr. Kellogg's first concern was education. Education, in his words, education offers the greatest opportunity for really improving one generation over another. And that's education of the child, but also of the parents, and the teachers, and the doctors, and on and on. So a real priority in all of the areas, agriculture and the other divisions, with education. the Division of Medicine and Public Health, Division of Dentistry, Nursing, Hospital Administration, Education, Agriculture, and Latin American programs. And so I was one of the 7 with responsibilities in each of those areas. And you can immediately see the interrelationships. Why did agriculture come into that as a title? The first emphasis was education, sort of in the formal sense, school, elementary, secondary, but then higher education and the whole concept of a continuing education or lifelong learning. And Kellogg was very much a partner with the institutions and organizations which were engaged in that concept, but concentrating on health and then all aspects of education and learning. The real theme, if you read the history, and maybe you have, of the Kellogg Foundation, the first annual report was printed in 1941. Foundation was established in 1930. Mr. Kellogg was then 70 years old, still very active in the company, but started the foundation, and very active in the foundation. And during the first decade, they concentrated on 7 rural counties in south central Michigan. And Mr. Kellogg was personally very much active with the Board of Trustees during that period. He became essentially blind in 1941, died in 1951, so continued to be interested and engaged right up until his final trip to the hospital. So a remarkable man. He completed his formal education at age 14 and went to work selling brooms for the business that his dad had. And so just a remarkable man in the values and his vision in so many aspects of life. So learning about him has been an inspiration. He started out as a hospital administrator, quit his job when he was 46 years old and started the Kellogg Company. So that's another story, but a remarkable example in reading this. So that he and the Board of Trustees then, he formed the foundation in the spring of 1930, attended a White House conference on children and youth in Washington at the invitation of President Hoover. He had done some things in Battle Creek, came back to Battle Creek after that conference and said, well, I need to organize my philanthropy differently. So in the spring of 1930, formed the W.K. Kellogg Child Welfare Foundation, a board, a staff, just a couple of people, and began to develop their plan. Now what are we going to do? So they studied the work of other foundations, and in the annual report it says, after studying what others are doing and looking at various issues, the Board of Trustees finally made its first decision that the resources of the foundation will be essentially for the application of knowledge rather than for research or welfare, relief. I think relief was the word, either for research or relief. Research is being more generally supported from various sources, and relief, charity, is more of a responsibility of government. But the greatest challenge we see is putting to use that which is already known. We know a lot more about what good education could be than is generally practiced. We know more about what good health services could be and should be than is generally experienced. And in all of these areas, then the great challenge is to put to use that which is already known, and so here's the focus of the foundation. Started then in these 7 counties and grew from that. Agriculture then was not a word in the mission initially, but immediately when you look at health, if you solve the problem of clean water, and that's true locally, but globally in developing countries, the pure water is the greatest source of infant death, for example. Water and then nutrition. So agriculture was really concerned with food systems and food supply. And even now we get concerns about food safety, for example. And if you buy fresh raspberries from Chile, what kind of water were they washed in, et cetera. But those are the concerns that were expressed in that first annual report. Food safety, particularly then it was raw milk.
Sure.
And so it's just fascinating to see the commonality of some of those issues. So I became a part of the team. To everyone's surprise and to my amazement, I became, 2 years later, was vice president for all programs, working under the president with all of the areas, trying to understand nursing and dentistry and so forth. And you must know how dental schools were separated. How were the problems with the mouth and teeth separated from the rest of the body? So that it's not a part of health benefits. Anyway, I began to ask questions like that, and why do we operate in such patterns of foolishness? So I became vice president for programs in a couple of years after I was there. And then in 1970, Dr. Morris retired, and I became the CEO. Had the privilege of serving as CEO for 25 years till my retirement from 1970 to 1995. So just a lucky old farm kid again, who happened to be in a wonderful situation. In the summer of early fall of 1969, Bill Baldwin, who was the CEO of the Kresge Foundation, invited a group of foundation leaders to a luncheon meeting at Meadowbrook Hall, and that was the great home built by Mrs. Wilson and is now a part of the campus of Oakland University. Anyway, we were invited to Meadowbrook Hall for lunch by Bill Baldwin, and Dr. Morris was going, and he invited me as vice president to go along. And that was wonderful, because I met a lot of people I didn't know, and talking about what was going on in Washington in congressional hearings and decisions, which were then resulted in the Tax Reform Act of 1969. So there's just an update, and I had representative from Washington, the National Council on Foundations, I think, or lawyers and so forth, to talk about what's going on in Washington in those discussions. That was all new to me, because I was in agriculture and the foundation, and then had this broader responsibility and trying to figure out how do you get the nurses to talk differently and work differently with physicians and vice versa, and et cetera. So I was learning about all of those things and engaged in a variety of issues. Had started under agriculture. You see, this is where I never wanted a narrow job. I never wanted a very specific job description. I wanted to know what I was expected to do, but then I wanted the freedom to do also what else ought to be done. So I didn't want too narrow a fence. And I talked about that with Dr. Morris way back when he bought lunch, before I made a decision. Anyway, that led us, for example, to a first national initiative on the part of foundations to work with the 1890 land-grant universities segregated. So in 13 states, a second university, they had a land-grant university like MSU, they had North Carolina State University, but then, and that was the Extension Service, but North Carolina A&T was the black land-grant university. So, learned all about that, and most of the rural kids who were going to, foundations had worked with the private universities, like this Atlanta group, Spelman and Meharry and so forth, none with the public universities. But if you looked at black students, the numbers were at the public universities, and with the civil rights legislation of the mid-60s, the opportunities for those universities and those young people changed dramatically. So, as Director of Division of Agriculture, I invited myself to 7 of those institutions And we didn't do anything in agriculture. We did it in engineering and library science, wherever they saw opportunities that their institution ought to now be thinking of training their graduates for. So, you see, there's that. That's not agriculture at all, but it's rural kids, and it's their future. So, anyway, went to this meeting and learned about the issues which were being discussed in Washington, which resulted in the Tax Reform Act of 1969. A lot of the provisions of the act just right on target, very necessary, very good. There were some that were troublesome. So, and I suddenly became, that passed in 69, in 1970, in the summer really, I became president, and then with the title of CEO on September 1 of 1970.